Chapter 4.
Off! Leave me alone, you pests!
It wasn't long on his journey south that Chesney discovered that the animals of Lennis were very particular about their territory, even the tiny annoying ones. And just because something was small and annoying didn't mean it didn't also have really sharp, painful teeth. Chesney had been keeping his eyes on the horizon, and hadn't noticed when he walked right over a group of pack rat warrens. They certainly noticed. They voiced their complaint with high-pitched squeaks and shrieks, and chasing him for such a long distance that Chesney thought was ridiculous. "We can't even see the warrens from here." Chesney didn't exactly feel the best about hurting the small creatures, especially since it was his own fault, but it was about that point where the things had found the gaps in his leg armor that his patience was lost.
I said, "Buzz off!"
he yelled through gritted teeth. Summoning the power of both spirits, flames burst forth all around him. He tried not to burn so hot as to outright incinerate everything within a few feet of him, but his anger at the ridiculous situation was difficult to contain. The flash of fire was enough to scare away the pack at last, though the one that had been gnawing his leg might have a tough time regrowing its fur. He watched the smoking creatures disappear into the nearby brush and sighed. Suddenly, he felt quite out of breath, and his leg stung from the deep gash. The pain was surprising and made him tremble slightly. He still wasn't used to this sort of thing, and being hurt and alone made him a little scared despite his conviction. Reluctantly, he grabbed the bottle off his belt and dispensed out a pill. "I need to be careful with these." Not waiting for the full effect to run its course, he kept walking as it healed his wounds and his weariness. "I'm going to need to be really careful using these two spirits at once. It takes way more out of me than just calling forth fire. Actually..." He looked at the long dagger at his belt, then pulled it out.
"What I need is to get used to using you instead. I can't rely on magic for everything."
He took a few practice swings and tried to get used to the feeling. With just a few, he could tell he wasn't doing it perfectly. His wrist felt sore from the extra weight and control. His balance was wrong. The swings felt weak as well. But he resolved that the next time an animal came after him, he would try to drive it off with just the dagger. According to the sun, it was well past midday. Doing a bit of mental math, he tried to think of how long it would take him to get to the bridge to Resutar Island. If he kept walking at this pace, it would take an hour or so. An hour to get there. And by the time I get to looking at the island, the sun will get too low to search well, he thought with growing concern. He knew he could run the distance, but he'd use up a lot of energy doing it. What if he was attacked when he was exhausted? Could he justify taking another pill after? Something inside him felt strongly that time was of the essence, but those pills were very limited.
I need to stay cautious. If I make small mistakes, they could lead to big ones. Keep an even pace, Chesney,
he said to himself. Around the meager hills and small bunches of trees, Chesney found that the mayor was right about one thing. This area was indeed littered with the remains of a much larger city. At first, there were many structures he took for piles of rock or the remains of rock slides. But now that he looked at them with an eye for the truth, he could see there were piles of rubble and half-collapsed walls weathered by time. He wondered what life was like 10,000 years ago. It somehow felt wrong that a civilization that far removed by time seemed to be so much more advanced. What did that say about the current state of the world? Why hadn't civilization recovered and surpassed the ancient one by now? And what does that mean for the destruction caused by that terrible disaster? He thought, if the disaster was able to bring such a powerful civilization to the brink of destruction last time, will everything now be outright destroyed? The thought was not a happy one to dwell on. One step at a time, Chance, old buddy. Again, Tail's words in his mind helped him to refocus on what could be done now and leave the big questions for later. Rounding another hill, Chesney found himself in something that resembled a decayed town square. A large circle of flat dirt with some cobblestone peeking through, surrounded by some kinds of rubble. And at the center of it all was the miraculously, still mostly intact remains of a statue fountain. Of course, It was filled with debris, weathered down to smoothness, and chipped badly. But just barely. He could make out that the statue above was of 3 figures. The first, and largest of the 3 people stood up tall. He seemed male generally. In his hands, raised high in the air, was a circular plaque covered with symbols. He was wearing a simple long robe, and was looking to the heavens. The second, also seemingly a male, looked like a knight. In his right hand was a sword, on his left, a shield, and his body was covered with beautifully ornate armor. He was looking out to the horizon. Lastly, the third figure was female, a young woman kneeling with arms open and inviting, looking down almost right at Chesney. Odd that such a thing could survive the passage of time as well as it has. Chesney circled it, and marveled at the details. I would love to have seen what it looked like when it was built. Just then, he noticed a flash of reflected light from among a set of dead vegetation. Once cleared away, he saw that there was a plaque there. There were 2 sets of inscriptions, one in a lettering he did not understand at all, and a second in some very archaic writing he could mostly piece together, similar to the writings of the present. It read, "Sophie brought love to Lennis. Cormu brought courage to Lennis. Gabnid brought wisdom to Lennis. The people of Lennis praise these 3 great ones, and the immortals of Riga." Chesney was beginning to feel like he should have paid much better attention in history. He, like everyone on Lennis, was aware of the 3 great ones. But what were the immortals of Riga? What did they all do? He had always thought of them as simply incredibly gifted spiritualists, but seeing this made him begin to think there was much more involved. Did they defeat the ancient machine Dahlgren in the path? Were they the ones who sealed it away in the Tower of Gabnid? Chesney wondered what could be done now that they were gone. He hoped that somewhere out there was someone who knew more that could give him the answers. Reluctantly, he turned from the statue, and continued on towards Resutor Island. The going was hastened because this area was much flatter and less densely overrun with vegetation, no doubt owing to the remains of roads here. It wasn't long before he found himself at the bridge. A small part of himself, the spirit of fire, looked upon it and wondered what it would look like on fire. "Don't you start," he thought, shaking his head. The bridge was also obviously the remnants of a much greater bridge in the past. The bridge was flanked on either side by 2 wide, shattered pillars of white stone. Whatever the bridge was made from before, now it was a simple rope affair with dozens of overlapping wooden planks as a walkway. Even in the small breeze by the coast, it rattled and groaned and swung and bounced. He balked at the prospect of crossing such a thing at first, but he rationalized eventually that whoever had taken the girl Medea must have dragged her over the bridge, so obviously he could make it over being careful. That, or they ended up in the ocean, he thought to himself. Chesney's arms weren't quite long enough to comfortably grab both sides of the rope handles, so he had to make do with holding one side while trying to maintain balance in the middle of the bridge. Things were going well, one step at a time, until he got to just about the middle of the bridge. The wind seemed to gust just then, and he leaned more heavily against the rope handle. The tension at this part of the bridge was much more precarious, and Chesney suddenly found himself gripping the railing madly with both hands, and staggering just over the ocean far below. Slowly, maddeningly, he shifted his weight to the middle once more, and carefully edged further along the bridge until at last he was sure the bridge couldn't flip. He allowed himself a moment to gulp some much-needed air, then quickly finished crossing.
That was not a child-safe bridge.
He yelled to no one in particular while looking back at the thing. Huffing and turning his back to it once more, he looked at the island and contemplated his next move. Now that he was here, the island seemed much more vast. Far down the sheer cliffs that bridge had spanned, he could see a beach with no clear route to access. The island was dominated by trees and difficult rocky terrain that sloped upwards. Whichever direction he picked, it was going to be a slog. And if that wasn't enough, looking west he could see the sun a few short hours away from setting. It was then that he noticed a path that was etched into the vegetation and around the trees, and he remembered that there was a guy named Fritz that lived in these parts. He's either involved, or probably knows a few good places to hide here. If I'm lucky, this path is his doing, and leads right to him. Shrugging, he followed it. The way was a wandering one, but it skirted around the most difficult terrain. At times, he felt like it was sending almost totally back the way he had come, only to loop around again and show him the path would have led up to a sheer rock face if it hadn't turned. The trees here seemed much more lush and beautiful than the ones at the magic school or along the coast to Ratzurk. These ones were taller and thicker, their leaves so diverse in hue. Bright cyan leaves giving way to deeper teal, and dark greenish blue. It was like staring into a churning ocean above his head. The forest floor was covered in gently swaying plants with fluffy pod-like things on top. These flower things were in many pastel shades, and when he passed by close to one, it popped, and hundreds of tiny feathery seeds exploded everywhere within a few feet. They were harmless, of course, but seemed to stick to Chesney's leg armor like glue. He wiped most of them away, but some were apparently sticking around for the long haul. I guess this is how they spread around. He was about to walk away when he saw something strange. Something bright green under a dense patch of flowers. His curiosity piqued. He brushed aside some of the vegetation, getting a face full of a few more puffs of seeds, of course, and found that the green he had seen was in fact the indicator light for another emergency pod, like he had seen in the Tower of Gabnide. This one was in much worse condition, and it took some heaving and cutting to get it out of the ground. With it heaved out of the ground, he sat down in front of the egg-shaped device and pressed his fingers to the light. With a snick sound, along with some crunchy, grinding noise, it opened once more like an iris. Within was another set of empty cavities and a firm foam that looked like it had held all sorts of useful tools in the past. At present, there was only one thing still remaining, another small bottle of some kind. Picking it up, he could hear the rattle of more pills inside. Chesney pulled out the bottle he already had, and when he compared them, he could tell they were different, but what that meant was completely beyond him. Still, it was no doubt valuable, so he slipped it in his bag and got up to leave. Maybe he could ask about it back at the tool shop in Ratzurk. Back to the trail he went, brushing the seeds out of his hair. Up and up, deeper and deeper, Chesney ventured further into the forest. The canopy grew fuller, the light dimmer, the sounds of forest quieter. He could see the rustling of leaves high above, but the wind could not reach him here. Perhaps it was the new quiet that had descended upon him, or just fortuitous timing, but he began to hear a distant thudding or cracking noise. His heart trilled in his chest. He suddenly felt very alone in the forest. Quietly as he could, he pulled the dagger from its sheath, and held it before him. To his shame, he could see the blade's tip tremble. "Keep it together, Chesney," he told himself. On alert now, he treaded the path forward quietly, following the repetitive thumping. With each thump, he felt like his heart was beating harder in his chest. The trees here were at their thickest, and it felt like there could be something behind every new tree. And still he grew closer to the sound. At last, he rounded a rather large trunk to see a simple hut off in a small clearing of trees. The hut was rustic, with walls made of wooden logs, and a roof covered in all manner of dried leaves. And, in front of the hut was a burly Gude, chopping wood in front. Instantly, a breath Chesney had been holding escaped in relief. There was just something about the demeanor of the man that put Chesney at ease. This must be that Fritz fellow. If I'm lucky, he can help me look for Medea, or at least know where to start looking, he thought. Not wanting to be rude, Chesney walked out from behind the tree, called out, and waved to the large man as he approached. With great ponderous ease, the Gude turned to look in his direction with an upturned eyebrow and a smile.
Well, what's a kid like you doing all the way out here?"
he asked, putting down his axe and sitting on the stump he had been using. He took a cloth from his pocket and used it to wipe the sweat from his brow. Now that Chesney was up close to the man, he realized there was definitely something different about him from all the Gude he had seen previously. His hair was a deep greenish hue instead of brown, and he had the big eyebrows he was much more accustomed to seeing on Lafrey. Recovering from his surprise at his features, Chesney took a moment to snap back into focus and answer him.
Well, that's a bit of a long story. Do you happen to be Fritz? I am indeed, though I wonder how you come to know of me. And you are? My name is Chesney. As for how I know about you, it was actually a mist. Ciao?
He said, cutting in.
Oh boy, not again.
Fritz sighed deeply and rubbed his eyes tiredly.
That woman doesn't know when to quit. All right, what did she send you here to say?
What did I just walk into?
Oh, wow. Wasn't really expecting this to start.
Chesney began, trying hard to think back to what she had said. His sudden question threw him for a loop, and his mind was playing catch-up.
Okay, she basically said she was thinking about you a lot, and wanted you to come back to Rotzerk to see her. But what I got...
Seemingly unaware he was interrupting, Fritz sighed out a reply.
Just tell her to buzz off already. Jeez. Kid, why do you think I'm living out here in the first place? Look, I'm sorry you made the trip for nothing, but I'm just not interested.
We're getting so off topic here.
Actually, sir, that's not why I'm here. I just happened to be coming to the island, so she asked me to pass along her message.
Fritz sat up a bit straighter.
It's not? Then, why? Do you know what happened last night?
The burly woodsman tilted his head and looked off and thought.
Well,
he began.
I noticed something like a big fire or explosion up north, I suppose. I couldn't see much because of the trees, just saw how the night was lit up something crazy.
Chesney wavered between wanting to keep to the absolute bare minimum of information, and maybe not have to tell this man the world was in the process of ending, and respecting him enough to tell him even if it would suck.
I'm not really sure how to tell you this, but are you familiar with the ancient legends of Dahlgren?
He said, wanting to look anywhere other than the man's face, but forcing himself to anyway. Fritz's face grew serious, and he said,
I think we better go inside and have a chat. I have some soup over a fire. Let's talk about it over lunch. Dinner. Whatever meal it is.
Before entering the cabin, Chesney would have bet the interior would have been quite austere, but he would have lost good money. The interior was alive with color. The walls were painted with small doodles and murals. There were furs, strings of gourds. It was one great room that was mostly kitchen, but it was a well-equipped kitchen you could have made anything in. In the middle was a table big enough for two, with well-carved chairs on either side, and a fire nearby with a pot bubbling over it. In the corner was a bed with a nightstand next to it with a lamp, and some books. It looked like a wonderful home, and Chesney smiled to see it. As he sat down in one of the two chairs, Chesney said,
Your home is beautiful. I love it.
Fritz smiled and nodded as he walked over to the fire and grabbed the pot with gloved hands.
Thanks. I'm rather proud of it. My pops taught me everything about building, and my ma taught me all about decorating.
He chuckled. Carefully, he ladled two portions out for them into bowls, and sat across from the boy.
So, why don't you start from the beginning?
And so, he did. He started out at the monster coming from the tower. He didn't exactly want to advertise his part in the beast's creation, or awakening, or whatever had happened. Chesney had a lot of questions about the nature of Dahlgren and the threat to the world, but he wasn't going to go back to the magic school and face those face everything. He told of his mission, to track down the monster, and that he had volunteered to rescue Midia, Rotzerk's protectress.
Wow, really? A kid like you volunteered to go look for Midia, with everything else already on your plate. Damn, that's incredible. You're something, kid.
Chesney was suddenly filled with a mixture of pride and shame, and he wasn't really liking how the two mixed together. He didn't know what to say to that kind of praise, especially since he hadn't actually accomplished anything yet.
So, you know about Midia?
He asked, changing the subject a bit.
Oh, for sure. I saw her a lot whenever I visited Rotzerk.
He started, nodding.
She's such a sweetheart to everyone, no matter who. When someone needs her help, She doesn't hesitate at all. She fends off beasts, and she can cure certain ailments as well. She is an accomplished spiritualist for her age. It doesn't surprise me the folk in town seem lost with her. Ever since she was a little girl, she's basically been the heart of Ratsurt.
Chesney closed his eyes, thinking on that a moment.
I think it's important I find her as quickly as possible. I have a bad feeling about it. You mentioned the cable for the rope network up north was cut intentionally, right? And she was taken in the confusion from that and the attack. Yes, it all seems too much for coincidence.
He sat still, rubbing his forehead with his hands for a long moment that seemed to drag on for over a minute. Finally, he said, simply,
I'm coming too.
Chesney nearly choked on a particularly large vegetable in the soup.
I'm sorry, what? The more I think about it, the more I don't like what's going on, and I would feel absolutely awful if I let you go into this kind of dark situation without any help. It's just how I am. That's that. I'm coming along.
Chesney felt like the polite thing to do might have been to fight it, protest, ask if he was sure. But instead he let out a sigh of relief and simply said, with a grateful smile,
Thank you, Fritz.
He was about to ask if there were any potential places on the island he could think that might be a good place to start looking, but when he took a breath, he immediately started coughing. There was something in the air. Fritz bolted up and pointed behind Chesney.
Smoke coming from the wall. Fire. It's on fire.
Chesney stood up so fast the chair he sat on skittered to the floor. He turned and also saw thick plumes of smoke pouring through the cracks in the wall, and barely audible cracks and crackling outside. And there was something else, too. Hooting, hollering, gibbering voices. Just then, from the windows on either wall came a crash, and a few humanoid creatures burst through the openings. They were short, stout, brutish-looking things. Thick, bumpy brown-green skin, no hair, a huge head with a pointed jaw. The jaw looked deadly strong. When they opened their mouths to shout and screech, he could see a mouth filled with brutal, jagged fangs. And if that wasn't enough, on each of their foreheads were jagged, vicious-looking horns.
Goblins!
Fritz managed to yell before turning and reaching for a bow and quiver of arrows mounted on a nearby wall. 3 of the things had clambered into the cabin, and quickly surrounded the pair. Fritz had just enough time notch a bow and say,
Time to fight. Kid, these guys are bad news. Don't hesitate.
Before the group of goblins charged them. Chesney wasn't nearly so prepared as Fritz, and fumbled for the dagger. He grabbed at it and tried to pull it from the sheath, but in his nervousness, it slipped from his fingers and fell to the floor under the table. The creature gave him a hideous, toothy grin as it stepped closer and closer. Chesney couldn't think. He could only scramble backwards as the goblin stalked after him, until finally he felt a wall behind him and there was nowhere else to go. Chesney managed a glimpse at Fritz, but he was busy flinging arrows over a counter and keeping the other 2 occupied. He was on his own. The goblin in front of him growled, and leapt right at him. He cringed to the side, and managed to avoid being gored by the creature's horn. He scrambled behind the creature and made for his dagger that had rolled under the table. Just as his fingers brushed the handle, 2 iron-like hands grabbed his leg and yanked him back.
Let me go, you freak!
Chesney bellowed, and threw his hand behind him at the creature's face. Instinctually, the flash of fire erupted right into the goblin's face. It squealed, dropped Chesney's leg, and covered its face protectively. This gave Chesney the moment he needed, and he lunged for the weapon. He had just enough time to grab it, stand, and face the goblin when it regained its composure. If I can't stop this thing, my whole quest is hopeless. I have to do this. Myself. Now. Acting on sheer nerve, Chesney screamed and charged the goblin just as it growled and lunged at him. Its great mouth opened and he had a split second to realize it was about to bite his face. Instead, he held up the buckler on his arm in the way, and the creature bit into it hard. Chesney was sure that if that had been his arm, it would have been broken. Rather than let go, the goblin instead clamped down even more. and shook his head back and forth, trying to force Chesney to stumble. Instead, he used the momentum to wildly plunge the dagger into the flesh at the creature's neck. As he stabbed the creature, the sheer sight, sound, and feel of stabbing another creature with the intent to kill filled him with revulsion. He almost let go of the knife. It felt so alien, so wrong, to be in this situation. He was so scared he was going to die, scared he'd made it mad, and it would tear him apart, scared he would fail before even starting, scared of the 100 eyes staring at him just at the corners of his vision, of the dead he had left behind, waiting for him to join them. I don't want to die. 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 He screamed then, high and full of wide-eyed terror. He was mindless now, instinct taking over where his youthful mind had failed. The dagger came up, and out, and then down again, deeper, up, and down, warm, hot, that, red, up and down, up and down. Time seemed to pass in an instant. When he regained himself, he was on top of the creature. It was no longer moving, and covered in small wounds. Chesney was breathing hard. He couldn't get enough air no matter how hard or fast he breathed. He was covered in blood. It was in his hair, on his face, dripping from the knife onto his hands in warm, sticky drops. When he saw what he had done, he wanted to drop the knife, run away from this. But his hand wouldn't let go. His hand hurt so much, but he couldn't drop it. He couldn't run away from this. It was then that he heard a twang, followed by a shrill squeal. Chesney turned to look. The 2 other goblins were like pincushions. Each had a handful of arrows buried in their skin. One even had one lodged in its eye, but miraculously, was still up and still trying to tear Fritz apart. The counter Fritz had been using for cover had been smashed, and now he was vulnerable. He could see what would happen next. Fritz would hit one with an arrow, and the other would tackle him and he would be gored, killed right in front of him. He could not let that happen. Not just because he was warm and kind, had welcomed him into his home, and offered to help him, but because if he failed now, he would never stop failing. He would always be too late. Not enough. And there would be more dead eyes, staring at him, hating him. No more. His hands thrust out, and power filled the room. 2 spirits within him tittering, agreeing, yelling. The pair of goblins stopped in their assault long enough to turn, and see their world turned into a burning inferno. At its center, 2 glowing eyes filled with anger and fear. In some part of him, he knew he should stop, but he was far too afraid to stop the flames, feared that if he stopped, they would emerge alive and hurt him, or Fritz. He could feel the life draining from him, but he couldn't stop. No more. He could hear something, but nothing could reach him now. Suddenly, a body tackled him, grabbed him up, and pulled him away. He had a vague recollection of a room quickly filling with smoke and red, hungry light. More time passed, and it was a moment before Chesney regained himself and he realized what had happened. Fritz and Chesney stood outside the cabin, watching as flames engulfed it. Chesney was tired, more tired than he could ever remember being in his life, and cold, and the ground looked so warm and inviting. He just wanted to lay down and sleep. He was close to death. He could feel it, knew it in some part of his mind. He had used too much, far too much. He needed to take the medicine. But the ground was so warm and comforting. Couldn't he just close his eyes for a second, and then start the laborious work of finding the bottle, opening it, taking a pill? No, he just wanted to rest. His eyes closed. He tasted something, and it tasted like, "Wake up before you die, fool." Thought on no one. Chesney gasped back awake, a half-dissolved pill in his mouth, and Fritz standing over him with a deeply concerned look on his face. He shot upright, and looked around in a panic.
"Back with us, eh, Chesney? You looked about half dead, but Thankfully, I keep a stash of paracetamol on me for emergencies,"
Fritz said, relaxing somewhat, and shaking a bottle looking remarkably similar to the one that Juliet had given him. There were a dozen words trying to escape Chesney's mouth. He wanted to say he was sorry for the fire, the cabin, just in general everything, but what came out was,
"Wait, that stuff has a name."
Fritz chuckled a bit, and held out a hand, which Chesney took, and pulled him up off the ground.
Yeah. Did you never read the label?"
Chesney thought back.
"Wait, isn't it all weird gibberish on the front?"
he said while fishing the bottles he had out of his pocket. He looked at the labels, covered with some strange script he couldn't understand in really small letters. He'd just known from past experience that the labels were all incomprehensible and hadn't actually looked at them any closer after that. Fritz gave him an incredulous look, furrowing his big green eyebrows, and pointed to the label on one of the bottles Chesney had pulled out.
"Well, yeah, but on the bottom it has all the same text, but in our language. See?
Paracetamol, for adults and children over the age of 12. Take to relieve fatigue and mild bleeding. Take 1 pill every 4 hours until symptoms cease. If symptoms do not lessen after 1 hour, seek medical attention. Paracetamol is not a replacement for rest. Do not exceed 4 doses in a 24-hour period." Chesney couldn't believe he had missed that. He felt like a complete embarrassment, having something so obvious explained to him by someone he just met. He felt like a stupid kid. He was also a little concerned about what he had read on the label. Up until now, he hadn't been too concerned about taking them when he wanted, but it sounded like too much could be dangerous. Looking at the other bottle he had just found, he scanned the label until he found something he could read. Paracetamol, for adults and children over 12. Take to relieve poisonous or venomous effects. Works in most cases. Take immediately after symptoms present themselves. If symptoms do not lessen in 15 minutes, seek medical attention.
"Well, that answers that question,"
he said quietly to himself. Sighing, he stashed them back in his bag, and looked back at the smoldering cabin. Another home destroyed. I'm cursed.
"I'm so sorry about this, Fritz. If
Chesney began, but was interrupted by Fritz.
"Don't be ridiculous, kid. You didn't do this. It was those damn goblins. You're alive. I'm alive. That's all that matters. I can rebuild this any time,"
he said. He smiled then, and put a hand on Chesney's shoulder.
"Thanks for having my back."
He had no idea how to respond to Fritz, but he felt so grateful for the words.
"You're welcome."
Fritz scratched his head in thought, and spoke out loud while thinking to himself,
"I don't get it, though. Why would they just attack us like that? They usually just stick to their cave, have their little dances and ceremonies on the beach."
Something clicked in Chesney's mind.
"You say they have a cave they live in?" "Yes. Why?" "And what do you think would happen if some strange people came into that cave?" "Well, they sure wouldn't be happy. Once I walked a little too close to it and they chased me halfways back here." "Wait, you don't think?"
Chesney just nodded with a bit of self-satisfaction.
"I think we know exactly where our kidnappers took Medea."
Fritz perked up and turned to Chesney, eyes wide.
"You know, I think you've got the right of it. Come on, I'll show you the way. It's a short walk to the beach, and the cave is right there."
They hurried down a nearby path together, at as fast a pace as they dared within the dense forest. Excitement, or maybe just adrenaline, filled Chesney's heart at having a real lead. He had help. He had a destination. He would not fail. When they reached the beach, they saw the corpses of 2 more goblins, and dozens of sets of footprints in front of the cave.
"These guys mean business,"
Fritz said, balking slightly at the sight.
"Which is all the more reason we should hurry. If we are lucky, they're still here. I can't imagine why they would come here, though. Do you have any ideas?"
Fritz shook his head.
"I have no idea either. This cave doesn't have another exit as far as I've seen. There's nowhere to go.
They entered together, and their steps echoed softly around them as they stepped in the small tide pools and sandy rocks. It got dark very quickly. Without needing to be asked, Fritz pulled a few stalks of some kind of plant from his bag, grabbed them on both ends, and seemed to snap or fold them all in half. In a few seconds, they began to glow with a dull, red light. It wasn't much, but they could see about 10 feet in front of them. Chetsney began to wonder to himself about why the kidnappers had entered this cave. If they had intended to kill her, they could have done that right in Ratsurt. So, obviously, they needed to take her away. But is this where they needed to take her? Or is there somewhere else? If it was somewhere else, why stop here? Maybe something went wrong. But that doesn't answer why they kidnapped her in the first place. Could she have some kind of special power? All he was doing was racking up more questions without answers, and it was making him antsy. He didn't know what was going on, and it was disturbing to him to walk into a situation where he could be missing something really important. The cave was spacious to walk through. The sea had carved it out well. All along the floor were small tide pools with smooth edges, and tiny scampering things. The walls were wet, and dotted with scratch marks and crude paintings. He presumed they were from the goblins who had made a home here. As they got deeper, the space inside actually widened into a much larger cave structure with huge open rooms, connected by short, claustrophobic caves. Small holes in the rock above let in thin streams of light. In that dim light, Fritz pointed out another pair of goblin corpses. The pair stood over them and could see several deep cuts across their chests. This was definitely the right way. Though it was hardly the time for it, Chetsney found himself lost in his own nerves. To distract himself, he asked Fritz a question that he'd been wondering about.
So, Fritz, can I ask you a question?
Chetsney whispered. At the man's raised eyebrow, he continued.
Why do you live all the way out here by yourself instead of Ratsurt?
Fritz tilted his head and looked at Chesney for a moment, before answering.
You can't tell already?
Chesney shook his head. Laughing softly, he said,
Kid, I'm a Lubot.
Chesney gasped with realization.
Oh, I see. That's why you have the big laughery eyebrows. And green hair.
Fritz nodded, and added,
Yep, Ma was laughery. Pops was a good. Okay, but I still don't get it. What does that have to do with you living off on your own?
Chesney asked, hoping he wasn't stepping into sensitive territory, but too curious to stop now. Fritz sighed and looked down the dark path ahead of them. A few heartbeats later, he elaborated.
Well, kid, some folks just aren't as understanding of mixed races, I guess. When Mom and Dad got together, they started living in Ratsurt at first, but there was always talking and whispers. I don't think they meant anything by it, but it just got to be too much always getting so much attention. So, they moved out here, had me, and when they passed on, I stayed. I guess I've lived a pretty sheltered life, so far. I had no idea that was something people cared about. I sure don't, Fritz.
Chesney replied, wondering what else about the world he was clueless on.
Well, I appreciate that, kid. Believe me, I do go in from time to time, for supplies of course. I've heard all kinds of stories. For example, I've heard that in Sasquatch, it's not only frowned upon, but outright illegal. Nasty rumors floating around about Sasquatch these days.
Chesney was about to launch into a discussion of why he was avoiding Miss Chow, when he heard something, and raised up his hand and put a finger to his lips.
Listen.
Beyond the sound of dripping water and the dying echoes of their footsteps, there was a sound, very faint, just barely on the edge of hearing. Chesney couldn't tell what it was. Fritz shrugged as well. So, they both proceeded at a more careful, quiet pace down the hall, weapons firm in their grip. As they got closer, the indistinct noise became clearer. It was a voice, singing softly. Recognition crossed Fritz's face. He whispered excitedly.
That's her. That's Midia.
So, she's still alive. A huge weight seemed to lift from Chesney's shoulders. He hadn't realized how tense he had been, but upon hearing that, his muscles he hadn't realized he had been tensing all loosened together, and he suddenly felt quite weary. Not yet. Not until we are back in Ratsurt. The echoing of the cave gave the girl's voice an ethereal, otherworldly sound. It sounded as though the song was coming to him from across ages, like an echo through a doorway from a memory. The tune was not bright, nor cheery, nor melancholic. It was serene, soft, light. It would pick up and fade again, as they carefully walked through the cave system, following the voice, as though the singer was only half-heartedly singing the tune. Still, the voice was practiced and true like that of a songbird. Chesney had a hard time imagining the voice coming from a good, young or old. Obviously, I have a lot to learn, he thought to himself. At last they came to the mouth of a medium-sized alcove from where the song was being carried from. Quickly, Fritz peered around the corner, nodded, then turned to Chesney.
She's alone. Quick, you go free her. I'll keep a watch out here,
he said, and knocked an arrow on his bow while squinting into the half-darkness. Nodding, Chesney hurried into the room as quietly as he could. The alcove was not much larger than Fritz's cabin had been. It was dominated by a great red-orange beam of light from the sun through a gap in the ceiling. Stalactites met stalagmites at the far side of the room, and a form sat huddled there in the gloom. It moved at his approach.
Medea, I've come to rescue,
Chesney began, but stumbled over the rest as he saw the girl stand up and face him, bathed in the aura of sunset, like a halo of holy light. She was not Good. She was Lafrey. Her hair was long and a dark, shiny purple, held back in a ponytail by a red hair tie decorated with clear red glass beads. She wore a pink cloak, embroidered with many intricate rustic designs, atop simple traveling clothes. Her face was the picture of calm serenity, with slightly pointy ears, and surprisingly subtle eyebrows for a Lafrey. And her eyes. Bold, striking blue, like the sky just before noon. When they locked eyes, he couldn't look away. It was like finding the sun existed when you had only ever lived in darkness. He couldn't explain it, but he felt some strange familiarity or inevitability when he looked at her. It was an impossible to describe feeling. At the same time, they both spoke over each other. Medea gasped, her expression filling with surprise.
Who are you?
While Chesney blurted out,
Wait, you're not a Good?
After that, both tried to speak again, and interrupted each other once more. Sighing, Medea raised her hands, and said,
Ropes first, we can talk after. Right,
Chesney said, reddening from the unexpected change of circumstances, and his own failure to communicate. He quickly knelt down and started carefully drawing his blade over the girl's bindings. Her wrists were bound in expertly tied rope, and the rope was then secured around where a stalactite and stalagmite had grown together. How is she a Lafrey? Isn't she the mayor's daughter? How did that work? He thought to himself of all the mentions and information he had gleaned about Medea, but looking back, there was one thing that the shop owner had said.
When she came to us 13 years ago.
What had that meant? The rope was tough, and it was hard to cut through. As he worked, the silence between them grew, until Chesney was the one to break it first.
Chesney. My name is Chesney.
He spoke in a half-whisper. She managed a strained smile, and looked anxiously to the cave mouth before asking,
Is it just you? Are you alone? Fritz came with me. He's keeping watch in the passage,
Chesney explained, looking up at her, again, bathed in the light of the setting sun, and ruining his night vision again in the process. Her face screwed up into something between a question and a frown.
Did those two mercenaries in the bar leave town? Why aren't they here?
Chesney's face darkened. He didn't like thinking of the humiliation he faced asking for their help.
Not interested, apparently.
Medea's expression quickly transformed from polite concern into one of abject fury.
Not interested? In rescuing a kidnapped 13-year-old girl.
Her fists clenched, and she breathed in a great breath of air like she was on the verge of exploding in rage. Tiny sparks of static leapt over her fingers and between her hands, and in his close proximity, Chesney could feel the hair on the back of his head stand on end. She mastered herself, though, and hissed through gritted teeth,
"I'll kill those two."
Chesney absolutely believed her. She looked terrifyingly angry. After a few calming breaths, her expression lost its edge, and she said,
"We need to hurry. The soldier who kidnapped me will be back any moment. Did you see him on your way here?"
Chesney shook his head.
"We didn't see anyone, just dead goblins."
A few moments passed before Chesney had a thought.
"Wait, did you say soldier? As in, singular? One person killed all those goblins?"
Grimly, she nodded.
"Yes, while also holding on to me."
Crap, pot. That can't be good. Just then, he heard a snapping noise behind him. Turning to look, he saw a panicked-looking Fritz in the room trying to get his attention, pressed against the wall beside the door. He notched an arrow and drew his bow and gestured wildly out the door. Double crap! That's really not good. From the darkness beyond the mouth of the alcove came a strangely accented voice, accompanied by splashing footsteps.
"Well, finally, I can see the ship on the horizon. Time to—"
He stopped mid-sentence as he walked in and spotted Chesney. The man was a type of being Chesney had never seen before. He was humanoid, as all the sentient races of Lennis were, but it was also very dragon-like. His skin was very smooth and completely purple, and his huge three-toed feet ended in deadly talons, knees that bent backward like a bird's, a long tail that slithered on the ground behind him, an elongated, smooth head with no hair, ending in a tapered jaw lined with teeth. The strangest thing about this being was that it had wings, large ones, but instead of growing from the arms or the back like one would expect, they grew from the sides of the thing's hips. He was obviously a soldier of some kind, though. He wore striped yellow armor of some kind Chesney had never seen, obviously tailored to the kind of creature this was. His sides and hips, shoulders, and wrists were all well protected, and most importantly, in his hand was a long, curved blade. He held it firmly and naturally, and it seemed to move through the air with ease like it was simply a natural part of the man's arm. The being's face was initially shocked, but quickly his face and total body language changed to something far more relaxed, and he began to smirk. Chuckling softly, he said,
"Well, well, what do we have here? A little punk to come and save a little rent? I can't believe they sent a kid. It's honestly really insulting."
Chesney should have stalled, and tried to keep cutting through the ropes, but it was like the whole room was stuck in a single moment of time, waiting for someone to make the first move. He couldn't take his eyes off the great long blade in the being's hand. It made his dagger look pathetic. With a single smooth motion, it cut through the air, and pointed right at Chesney's face. His eyes followed it, completely transfixed like he was hypnotized. It wasn't just the blade, though. Being here, back against the wall, in this cave, against the odds, failing to free Midia in time, the horror of his own mortality crept into his veins like ice. In an instant, it was like every nook and shadow of the walls around him were the hollow eyes of everyone he had ever known, dead, and waiting for him to finally join them. He hadn't escaped. He wasn't alive. He had just managed to walk a little farther. The dragon-like thing growled a warning at him.
"That's enough of that, punk. That girl isn't going anywhere. Get up, and step away from her, now, and drop the knife."
His body felt so cold, already dead, just waiting to die. But, in a moment the feeling turned from a scary one into something approaching relief. Maybe I can stop. There's no way I can do this. And that's okay. I tried. He almost wanted to laugh softly to himself, and smile in relief. Someone was going to take the weight of what he had done off of his shoulders. This was always beyond him. He knew that. And now, everyone else would know it too, and someone else could save the world. It can't be me. I can't do it. And that's okay. But then, like a whisper from his own heartbeat, he heard something so soft that it couldn't truly be there. You don't deserve to die, Chesney. It was Samsa's voice, the kind girl who he could never work up the courage to speak to. It was her soft, sweet voice. He could almost feel her presence, her breath just behind his ear. Fight, Chesney. Live. For all of us. For me. For Medea. You cannot die here. Please. You must fight. And then, just behind his other side, a hand on his shoulder, and a voice carried on the sound of drops in water. Tail. Come on, Shades. This guy's a chump. I know you've got this. Easy. Be a freaking hero. Man! It was a single second, that stretched on forever. But he blinked, and said to himself, okay. I'll try. I won't give up yet. Chesney hesitated for just a fraction of a second, but he did stand. He did not drop the dagger. Instead, Chesney set his jaw, and gripped it firmly, and faced him. Instead of being even a little intimidated, the dragon thing laughed, and said,
Oh wow. Really? You want to face me?
It seemed to chuckle in a strange hissing way, before responding again.
Well, I honestly don't care if you're a kid. I am a loyal Alorn soldier for Lord Zagos's glorious empire, and I will cut down anyone in his way. But I've just a bit of time before I must go. So, let's play, punk twat. My name is Zatra. Show me what you got.
And Alorn. So, one of the races from Sasquatch. Interesting. Before he could think further, the soldier took a stance, then lunged at Chesney's chest with the blade. Chesney barely managed to sidestep and slap his dagger against the thrust, but his balance wasn't good and he almost tripped and fell. Medea gasped and tried to reach out to him, but the rope around her wrists kept her back. She furiously started to tug and pull and bite them. Chesney's body cringed, knowing he was wide open and expecting the simple slash that would slice into his exposed side, but it didn't come. Instead, the Alorn smirked and made exaggerated movements, and waited for Chesney to recover. Just as Chesney brought his dagger to bear again, the Alorn's blade seemed to flick at the tip of his dagger and nearly knock it out of his hand. The Alorn laughed, relaxed more, and started to talk as he seemed to fluidly dance through a series of well-practiced movements which Chesney could barely answer.
Ah, boy, your footwork is terrible. Your weight is always just in the wrong place. I could make you fall over and over again. And your grip, you wield it like a club. Fluid, like a leaf through water.
The Solider was obviously having a great time, but Chesney was anything but. He felt like any moment could be his death. He was absolutely being toyed with. It was then he looked over Zatra's shoulder, and saw a very serious-looking Fritz, bow taut in his firm, practiced arm, aimed straight at them. He must be waiting for the right opportunity. He took a chance. They would only have one shot. Trying to well up the anger in himself, he committed to a clumsy, powerful swing at Zatra's head. He needed to keep his attention on him. With a great hiss of laughter, the Alorn took the cue and blocked it easily, and held their blades locked as he pushed Chesney backwards with his superior strength.
This one has guts. I like him. Shame he must soon die.
Acting scared was not hard at all for Chesney now, and he allowed himself to be pushed backwards until his back pressed into the damp wall of the cave. Nearby, Medea was still straining hard against her bonds. Without a knife, though, it was almost useless.
Bad luck. Time to die, boy,
Zatra said, with some regret. He quickly jabbed with his arm into Chesney's gut, forcing him to fall to his knees, which he brought up his sword for a clean stroke, and got an arrow between his shoulder blades for his trouble. Yes. The Alorn screamed in confusion and rage, spinning behind him to see Fritz smirking while drawing another arrow.
Surprise!
Chesney yelled, shoving a hand at the Alorn's head just in time for him to turn to him. A burst of scorching fire consumed his flesh, and he screamed again, clutching at his face. Zatra leapt away from them both, and when his hands left his face, one half of it was a blistering ruin. His arms were trembling, either in rage or in pain. Fritz quickly ran to Chesney's side, and they squared up against the Alorn.
I think that oughta even the odds a bit. Eh?
Fritz said excitedly. Chesney risked a glance and a smile to his friend.
You saved my backside there, Fritz. Tix, I owe you one. You think you've won?
Zatra growled, taking up a different stance than he had used before. He only had one good eye he could use, and the arrow looked like it dug in painfully with every movement, but it seemed all the joviality was replaced with murderous rage.
You, punks, have no idea what you're dealing with.
Like a flash of lightning, Zatra closed the distance and cut a sideways slash across them both. The arrow that Fritz had been holding taut flew off uselessly, and he staggered backwards. Chesney got his dagger up in time to catch and redirect the energy. He could immediately feel the difference in strength Zatra could bring to bear against him. He was still formidable, but for the first time Chesney truly felt they at least had a chance. Filled with new excitement and a lot of adrenaline, Chesney took the initiative. He yelled and slashed down twice, first hitting the protective bracer on the soldier's arm, but the second one making a small gash. Unfortunately, that left Chesney open enough to take the pommel of the sword to the nose. With a sickening crunch, his face was on fire with pain and his throat filled with blood. Twang! An arrow flew through the air, right at Zatra's ruined eye. Some incredible instinct on the soldier's part seemed to detect the incoming projectile, and flick his sword up in another smooth motion to send it off harmlessly. Like a flash of lightning, the soldier managed to slash at the both of them, twice in a row. They both managed to block the first, but the second slash came in lower, and sliced deep into their flesh.
We can't let him do that again. Spread out. Let's try to keep him surrounded,
Chesney cried, and they both tried flanking the purple man. Chesney could see a great deal of blood soaking into Fritz's clothes, and he doubted he was much better off. The armor was protection, but it sacrificed much of it to allow for movement. Before Zatra could decide which of them to lunge at next, Chesney held up his hand and felt the stirring of the spirits inside him swell, and unleashed another blast at Zatra's body. He tried to evade, but black marks on his arms and armor showed he hadn't escaped unscathed. The move left Chesney out of breath, and he collapsed to one knee to regain some of his strength. With a snarl, Zatra took the opportunity to lunge at him again, using his much more powerful new stance. An arrow from Fritz sliced through the skin of the Alorn's leg, causing him to lose balance, and the blow struck much less firmly and off-target on the armor. In rage, the Alorn pulled a knife from a hidden compartment in his shoulder, and whipped it at Fritz from across the room. Fritz, completely surprised by the maneuver, was unable to dodge. The knife sliced through the bowstring, making it useless.
Enough games. You die, now.
Zatra cried, turning to face Chesney, still kneeling, and changing his grip to a firm two-handed one. Chesney, still out of breath, felt like he was on the knife's edge. He panicked, not knowing what to do next. He just knew he could not die here. In a moment, the two tittering spirits within him communed together, and through Chesney's arms, a powerful force burst out.
Freeze!
He shouted, and it was as if time stood still. Hovering just above him, Zatra was frozen in the middle of a strong downward swing. Dark rings clouded Chesney's vision. He was close to losing consciousness. 3 spells in just a few moments, plus the wounds, and the exertions of battle. It was almost too much. But this chance wouldn't last long. He had to take it. With a great effort, he stood, and brought his weapon down over and over onto the soldier. Deep cuts opened, but did not yet bleed, all over his flesh. Mid-swing, the flow of time resumed for the soldier, and he screamed in agony and fear. More slowly than he could move before, and barely holding on to his blade, he leapt away before the next blow could land. Rivulets of blood poured down his body and the near dozen wounds opened up by Chesney and Fritz.
I don't have time for this. You're coming with me, girly.
Zatra growled through heavy breath. He turned to where Medea should have been, arm raised presumably to cut the rope, only to find Medea gone. The rope had been cut, and an arrow lay nearby. From the shadows of the stalagmite, Medea emerged behind him. Her face, a mask of intense focus and anger. Her hands, now free, were crackling with energy. She whispered,
"Nighty-night,"
before pressing 2 pairs of fingers to his temples, and sending a massive jolt through his head. The cave was thrown into a contrast of white and dancing black as the flashing lightning coursed the Alorn, causing him to jerk uncontrollably. The Alorn screamed once more, somehow barely remaining standing.
"Lord Zagos, forgive me,"
he croaked, barely able to get the words out. Then, he collapsed to his knees, dropped the sword, and then fell face down onto the wet cave floor with a smack. For a few moments she stood over his fallen form, face firm, arms at the ready in something close to a martial arts stance. Small arcs of electricity jumped across her body, and the wet ground, making the air in the room smell of ozone and the hairs on Chesney's neck stand on end. Despite his own bone-deep weariness, Chesney couldn't help but first be concerned about Medea. He pushed himself to his feet, walked up to her and asked,
"Are you okay, Medea? Are your wrists too?"
But before he could continue, she turned to him and hugged him fiercely. His body ached at the force, but at the moment all he could feel were his cheeks going red.
"You saved me, Chesney. And you too, Fritz. I can't thank you enough. I was so scared,"
she whispered, though the small noise still filled the small cave. Up until now, through her words and actions, Chesney had gathered the impression that Medea was a fierce kind of girl, but he was beginning to wonder if there was a lot more to her than that. Fritz grabbed his now broken bow and walked to them.
"I came as soon as I heard. What happened that night?"
Medea let out a shaking sigh, then released Chesney. She took a moment to rub her face and compose herself before answering.
"The night that terrible creature attacked, it was such a surreal moment. People were running, yelling, Goobas screaming and trampling over themselves. I had just gotten a few people to get water, and to round up the Goobos, when someone told me the rope network's rope had been cut. I went in to look, finding that a little suspicious, when someone from behind grabbed me and threw me to the floor. He bound my hands, and gagged me, then threw me over his shoulder and ran into the night. The last I knew of Ratzurk was still all screaming and fire. All I could think was that it was my job to keep everyone safe, and if they would be okay."
A haunted look passed over her eyes, and she turned to Chesney and asked, her voice hitching,
Is my dad okay?"
Chesney replied with a gentle smile.
"Not only is he just fine, but nobody was seriously hurt." "Really?"
she started, with genuine surprise. When Chesney nodded, she continued,
"That's amazing. That creature was so terrible. All I could make out was a massive form, huge teeth, wings, and fire. Everything was fire. I thought for sure the entire town would be destroyed."
She looked like she was lost in a memory for a moment, but then she shook her head and looked at them both, with a determined look in her eyes.
"We need to go. I am pretty sure whoever Zatro is going to meet will be here very soon, and I need to get back to Ratzurk as soon as possible. But before that, here."
She took a bottle of what looked to be minoketamol from a pouch on her belt, gave both Chesney and Fritz 2 pills each, and 1 for herself. Immediately, the red bruises on her wrists started to lighten, and the small gashes on Chesney and Fritz's bodies stopped bleeding.
"I hate to use so much of these,"
she said with a worried frown,
"but I think this is an emergency. Come on, let's hurry out of here."
As they hurried out of the cave, Chesney had a niggling little worry in his mind based on the look Medea had given them when dispensing out the pills. He almost didn't want to ask, but something was telling him that staying quiet about this might not be the best idea.
"So, Medea, you looked really tense about giving us the minocetamol. Can I ask why?"
Without breaking stride, she answered,
"Well, as the protectress of the village, I've been trained in some basic first aid. Minocetamol is very useful, but it's really for emergencies only. 2 is a lot to dose out at once, but you both look like you needed it. Especially you, Chesney. So many spells at once, on top of your wounds. You could have died.
Chesney's insides were beginning to form a knot.
So, what happens if you take too many?
She gave him a searching look as she answered.
Over the short term, nausea, headaches, and weakness. Long term, it can lead to damage to the body's lymph structures and bone structure. But that would take years of abuse. Why do you ask? Have you already had some today?
The knot was getting bigger.
Maybe. Yes.
Chesney said.
I had to give him some before we got to the cave.
Fritz added, keeping up with their pace and also trying to remove and replace the string on his bow.
Actually,
Chesney said with growing trepidation.
I've had more than that earlier.
Midia's look grew serious.
Chesney, how much have you had in the last 24 hours? In the last 24 hours?
He began, looking away as he tried to count the number of pills. He had taken a lot right after waking up in front of the Tower of Gabnid, and then a few more on the way to Rishutor Island, the ones Fritz had given him outside his burning cabin. And then these two.
Honestly, I'm not sure. At least a whole bottle's worth, maybe more.
Midia's face paled, and she staggered to a stop. Even Fritz seemed appalled.
Chesney, that's a huge amount. Massive. That's a dose so big I don't even know what it could do. When we get home, you need some serious rest and a lot of water. How are you feeling?
Chesney tried to take stock of himself, but he honestly felt mostly okay, aside from the weariness which hadn't abated much since the fight.
I think I'm just tired. It's been, well, a really long day.
A really long day, indeed. She had them stop a moment just before leaving the cave, and placed a hand on his forehead. He tried not to blush at the sudden contact. She looked into his eyes, which he struggled to meet, before closing them and concentrating.
I have the ability to remove poisons from a person. I don't know if this kind of thing counts, but I feel like I should try anyway.
Chesney could feel a coolness build at his forehead where she was touching him. Then, she applied a slight pressure or push, and the wave of coolness passed through his body in an instant, leaving behind a tingling feeling that lasted a few seconds.
How do you feel now?
She asked, still looking quite concerned. Chesney again took stock of his body.
I think,
he said, pausing a moment longer to move around his arms and legs.
It's a bit easier to move, and I don't feel quite as out of breath. I'm still really tired, though.
She sighed with relief, nodded, and smiled.
Good. I'm really glad I was able to help you after you risked your life like that. You are either very brave or very foolish.
Fritz laughed and clapped Chesney hard on the back.
Ah, I think he's plenty of both, aren't you, lad?
Chesney had nothing he wanted to say in reply to any of that, so instead he distracted everyone by ushering them out of the cave. As they ran up the beach back towards Fritz's cabin, Fritz pointed to a shape on the water.
I suspect that's what our good friend the soldier was talking about. We had best be gone from here, and quickly.
As everyone looked, they could see some kind of large sailing vessel coming towards the island. Looked to be less than an hour away. Nodding, they all continued up the path. Once they reached Fritz's burned-out cabin, Midia gasped in shock and pity.
Oh no, Fritz! Your house! What happened? Yeah,
he sighed, crossing his arms.
It'll take a little while to repair. Goblins got to it and set it on fire with us in it.
Chesney was grateful to not have his own role in the out-of-control blaze mentioned.
I don't suppose you could ask your dad to send some construction materials back here when you get back to Ratzur?
Fritz asked.
Of course. I'll make sure they do, Fritz.
She smiled, giving him a hug.
Everyone is going to miss you even more, you big lug. Wait, aren't you coming back to Ratzur with us, Fritz?
Chesney asked. An unreadable expression crossed his face before being replaced with his usual smile.
Nah, kid died. I don't quite fit in there. Plus, There's some lady back there who drives me nuts. That's why I live out here. She's got a thing for Lubat, or something. A bit creepy. Yeah, she seems a bit much,
Chesney said. Fritz just laughed hard.
Kid, you know the half of it. But anyway, thanks for everything. Thanks for what?
He asked. Fritz's laughing softened, and he gently patted Chesney on the shoulder.
It was nice not being treated like a freak for once. So, thanks. Fritz, you're not a freak. Don't go saying things like that. Everyone loves you.
Medea chided.
Yeah, I know. Maybe I just like being a loner, okay? Now go on and get back home, and give him my best. And really talk up the heroism to your dad. Maybe I can make the cabin a little bigger if they give me lots of materials,
he said, laughing a great guffaw. After a few more goodbyes, the two children set off back for Retzer, without the older bushman around. Suddenly things felt a little strained between the pair, like both wanting to speak but being unable to. Finally, the tension got to be too much for the both of them.
So, how are? Sorry, you first. And no, you go ahead.
Another long silence. Chesney tried again.
So, I can't help but notice you're not a good. That was a bit of a surprise.
Medea giggled.
Oh, disappointed I didn't have a beard?
Chesney dropped his face into his hands.
Oh please, don't say that. It's been so hard not imagining that this whole time. Well, it's a bit of a long story, but yeah, as you have no doubt figured out by now, I'm adopted. Kinda by the whole village, really,
she said, thoughtfully, before turning to Chesney and asking,
Now you, why were you the one who came to rescue me? I've never seen you before, and suddenly you risk your life for me? Why? That is also a long story.
Because I'm responsible, and I have to make it right. I have to make everything right, or I will go crazy with guilt and shame. Part of him wanted to tell her everything, but another part of him was scared. Because of him, Dahlgren was activated, and that beast was freed and practically destroyed her entire village. Not to mention the ocean of blood staining his hands from everyone at school. The wounds of losing Tail, Samsa, the young boy Gig, the look on the headmaster's face, the fire, the rubble, the dark shapes on the ground. The wounds were still too fresh, and moving forward was the only thing keeping him sane. The thought of Medea finding out his role in the tragedy was just more than he could bear right then.
I'm the last survivor of the students at the School of Magic,
he said, staring over the horizon to where even now a plume of smoke rose. Medea gasped in shock.
Oh my God! Everyone else died?
It was clear she felt true anguish at the revelation. It made keeping the full truth from her all the more painful.
Well, there is one more. Headmaster Dakin. Well, that's good to hear, but where is he? Is he not with you?
Chesney was struggling with how to word this next part. It was so hard to not feel how he had felt when the headmaster had rounded on him and sent him away. That look of absolute despair and madness.
He was unwell. He sent me to find the monster of Dahlgren and stop it. The headmaster sent you, a child, out into the world to stop it? Alone?
Chesney couldn't quite speak just then, so he swallowed and simply nodded.
Then you're right. He must be unwell. I can't believe a kind man like him would do such a thing in his right mind. It's awful. It's cruel.
Clearing his throat, Chesney continued his story. Anything to move on from the headmaster.
After that, I followed the path of destruction to Retzer, learned that the village had lost its protectress, and set off to save you. I met Fritz on the way, and you know the rest.
He turned to look at Medea then. Her eyes were far away, her expression unreadable. The mood had turned, and they remained silent until they passed the monument honoring the three great ones. A wistful sigh escaped Midia's lips, and she bent down on one knee, clasped her hands together, and said a quiet prayer. Feeling foolish for just standing, Chesney clumsily joined her. He had never been one for praying, but he suddenly felt rude if he didn't follow her lead. She noticed the effort, and faintly smirked before finishing her prayer, and then standing up and continuing their journey home. After that, they filled the time with simple talk before finally arriving at the entrance of Rathsir. When Midia looked at the state of the town, tears began to well in her eyes.
I know you said everything was fine, but it's different when you can see it.
She trailed off, unable to continue with the emotions welling up within her.
I'm so thankful everything is okay.
She began to walk with purpose for the center of town, then jogging, and then full-out running. Chesney did his best to keep up.
Dad, I'm home. I'm okay.
She yelled through her tears. Like a wave, everyone in town seemed to notice her, or pop out of doors and windows and shout in joy at her return. Just then, the door to the mayor's house burst open, and the tired and old good seemed to have become years younger at the sight of his daughter. With new life, he ran to his daughter, who collapsed in his arms and shook with sobs.
Daddy, I was so scared.
He held her so tight it seemed like he would never let her go.
Oh gods, thank you. Thank you. Midia, my sweet child. It's okay. You're safe now. I'm here. You're home. Everyone is safe.
His voice was weak with emotion, and a great stream of tears ran down his face. Quickly, the plaza at the center of town filled with bodies as the whole town turned out to see their Midia return to them. Mercifully, they were quiet and respectful as the father and daughter pair shared in the grief and joy. Chesney was badly beaten, bloody, exhausted, and emotionally drained, but he held on to that feeling of hope like a lifeline. It was all worth it. In time, the sobs and sniffs slowed, and the two separated enough for Mayor Malspar stand and turned to look at Chesney.
Master Chesney, I, and this whole town, owes you a debt we can never repay. We will never forget what you have done for us.
And Chesney could see the deep gratitude in the mayor's eyes, mixed with the horror of a parent who had come so close to losing their child. Chesney's throat no longer worked, so he swallowed, and nodded. He could see something else in the mayor's eyes, something he couldn't place. It seemed like there was something else there, perhaps that he wanted to say to him, and it wasn't good. Instead, though, the mayor smiled broadly, turned to the crowd, held up his hands, and addressed them all.
Everyone, this is a historic day. Our town has once again escaped ruin. Our people are all safe. This is a cause for celebration. Everyone, tonight, we celebrate our hero, Chesney.
Suddenly, all eyes were on him, and a great roar of cheers erupted. Before Chesney could even cringe away from the attention, hands surrounded him and held him aloft in a great cheering throng. He still felt guilty. That wouldn't never, ever stop. But, just for today, this one night, he would allow himself to give in. This was something the town needed. And, if he was honest, it was something Chesney needed too. It was his first success in a hopeless task, and his heart held on to that lifeline. If there was one thing that the Good were good at, it was partying. Amazing food seemed to appear out of nowhere, and everyone was dying to feed him some new dish. They were all incredible, though the names of the dishes got to be downright bizarre. Drinks flowed from the bar like a never-ending tide. Groups of revelers careened about the plaza. Toasts were made in Chesney and Fritz's honor more times than he could count. And while they assured him the drinks he was given were non-alcoholic, Chesney felt his mind numb and his laughter come easy the more he joined in. There was music and dancing, and the crowd refused to be denied when some people called for Chesney and Midia to twirl in the center. The pair were deeply embarrassed to be dancing for the crowd, which everyone seemed to find incredibly hilarious. There were games as well, though Chesney was too worn out to do anything but watch. The strangest had to be Gubo stacking. The creatures were remarkably docile, and one large Good was able to stack 6 on top of one another before the whole pile collapsed. At one point, Miss Chow cornered him and peppered him with questions about Fritz. Medea had come to his rescue, though, and dragged him away, pretending she had something he needed to talk to her dad about. He was grateful, and she smiled and winked at him in such a way that made his heart skip a little. Chesney's favorite part of the night, though, was Medea, also having several supposedly non-alcoholic drinks, taking it upon herself to reprimand the two mercenaries in the bar. She kicked the door to the tavern open, and stomped over to the cool pair. Chesney suddenly became very aware that Medea had been raised in an environment filled with burly, wild people, as she screamed and cursed at the two of them at the top of her lungs, using language so colorful that Chesney couldn't believe they'd come from a sailor, let alone a 13-year-old girl. Her eyes had even begun to glow, and static electricity and the smell of ozone filled the air. For a full 5 minutes, she told them exactly what she thought of them, and where they could shove the tools of their trade. By the end, the two of them honestly looked, if not remorseful, at least reproached. At the end, Medea stomped over to the bar, and told the man behind the counter,
"Their drinks cost quadruple now, and if they complain, kick 'em out,"
before leaving the bar without looking back at them again. Just before Chesney left to follow her out, the silver-haired one said,
"Hey, kid, you stayed alive. Good job,"
before tilting his glass in Chesney's direction, and returning to speaking with his more arrogant companion. Not long after, the weariness of the day caught up to Chesney, and Mayor Malspar insisted that Chesney stay at his house that night before continuing his journey the next day. Several simple beds were upstairs in the upstairs office, and Chesney practically collapsed into the one he had been given. His head was swirling with the music of the night, his worries of his journey, his health, and what he was supposed to do next. Lord Zagos! Who was that? What had he wanted with Medea? What if his soldiers come back and look for her again? Will Ratzerk be safe? Beyond that name, he had no further clues to follow. He guessed he would ask around tomorrow, and if nothing came up, he would simply have to follow the path of destruction to where it led next. To my next disaster. His mind was also consumed by thoughts of Medea. He didn't know why he was so concerned with someone he just met, but the thought of her finding out what he had done, and hating him, made his heart ache as deeply as it had when he had fallen to the ground in front of the burning school. The night passed slowly. Though exhausted, his mind rebelled against sleep constantly, spinning in circles, and so he was surprised to be jolted awake by a gentle touch on his shoulder. In the pale moonlight coming from the window, Chesney could see Medea before him, fully dressed in new traveling clothes, pink cloak, and a full backpack. In the quietest whisper, she said,
"Chesney, I'm sorry for waking you, but I had to talk to you." "What's wrong?"
he croaked, his voice hoarse from shouting at the celebration. She bit her lip, and looked him straight in the eye.
"I know this is going to sound weird, but when I saw you in that cave, it was like... pow. Like a lightning bolt. I felt like I was fated to meet you. Is that weird?"
Chesney shook his head.
"No. I felt something too. Like... not that I knew you, but that I should know you? That it was important I found you."
She smiled and nodded excitedly, though still whispered,
"Exactly. Now, I know you're going on a journey to defeat the monster of Dalgran, and it's really dangerous, but I feel like I have to go with you. Like, if I don't, something terrible will happen. I know, it's not logical, it doesn't make sense, but it's how I feel. Will you please take me with you?"
The look in her eyes was pleading, almost teary, like she didn't know what she would do if he said no, was hoping with every fiber of her being that he would say yes. A long moment passed before Chesney said,
"But what about your dad?"
Medea closed her eyes then, and he could see a single tear fall down her face in the moonlight.
"I know I'm being selfish. I really do feel bad. I love him so much, and everyone here. But I know if I don't go, everyone will be in even more danger. So, please, I'll follow you wherever you go. Chesney, I'll always be by your side. I swear it.
Searching his own feelings was an incomprehensible mess. Many conflicting priorities and worries clouded his mind. But in his heart, he knew that she was right. There was some shared destiny between them. Now that he had met her, he couldn't imagine leaving her behind. There was a pull there. Maybe it was destiny. Maybe it was the spirits within them. Maybe it was just because she was a really cute girl, which he was definitely not thinking about. But there was something undeniable about the rightness of her request.
Welcome aboard, Medea,
he whispered, with a sad smile. It was dangerous, and he would have to finally tell her everything, if she was coming. But for now, he was happy. She grabbed him in a firm hug, and whispered in his ear,
"Oh, thank you. I promise you won't regret this."
She let go, and stood up.
"Now, get ready as quietly and quickly as you can. We have to go before the house wakes up."
Chesney pulled back the sheets to reveal he had been so exhausted that he had never even changed out of his equipment. He grabbed his backpack from behind his bed, and together they tiptoed to the stairs and started downwards into the dark below. Medea turned to him, and motioned for him to watch where she stepped. He watched her careful, seemingly stepping on random areas of different steps, but she made no noise or creaks when she did this. Obviously, Medea was well versed in sneaking out. I'll have to ask her what kind of shenanigans she got up to, he thought. He also lamented why he had never really tried to sneak out of the school. When they reached the bottom of the stairs, she took his hand, for it was very dark, and led them towards the front door. It was then that a light clicked on, and her father, revealed to have been downstairs, waiting for them. Medea visibly cringed at being caught.
Dad, I'm sorry.
She stammered, but he simply came and gave her a hug.
Don't tell me you were going to leave without saying goodbye,
was all he said. She hung her head a moment, and whispered,
Sorry, Dad. I was just afraid. I understand. And I'm not going to stop you,
he said, looking at both of them in turn.
I knew when you came to us as a baby 13 years ago. On the night of the comet, I knew that this day would come.
Night of the comet? What did that mean? He thought. He resolved to ask Medea about it later.
When your late mother and I found you washed up on the beach, I took you in and raised you. You have grown up to become such an amazing young woman. Master Chesney, please take good care of her.
At that, her father turned to regard Chesney.
After we spoke, I resolved to take the time to check on Headmaster Dakin's well-being. We spoke at length, and he told me everything.
Oh no, please. Not like this, he begged in his mind, but to no avail.
Yes, he told me that you, Chesney, were the cause of this disaster that now threatens all of Lennis.
Medea let out a soft gasp at the revelation. He couldn't bear to turn to look at her. She probably hated him now. It took all of his mastery of himself to keep from betraying the pain in his heart, but his arm still trembled just a little. Barely, he managed to utter,
That's true, and that's why I must be the one to stop it.
To his shock, Medea actually grabbed his side and hugged him.
Chesney, I can't imagine how that must feel. I'm so sorry.
Chesney's mind became a blank. His heart couldn't process this show of care when he was expecting revulsion. He dared to ask the unaskable.
You don't hate me?
She looked into his eyes, and said,
Hate you? Chesney, I admire you. I don't for a second believe someone like you could have done that on purpose. All I see is someone trying his best to make up for a terrible mistake, even when it seems impossible. And I promise I'll help you every step of the way. We'll fix it together, okay?
Chesney could only swallow, his throat so dry from the tension, and whisper,
Thank you.
Medea's father cleared his throat, and the pair jumped like they forgot he was there. He continued,
Indeed, young master. He told me of your journey to defeat the beast. We decided where you should head next, as well. West of here, across the bridge outside of town, is the Western Forest, and beyond it, the city of Geraint. A great spiritualist resides there named Daphne. If you ask for her aid, she will help you. She is very wise and will be of great use to you.
He turned back to Medea.
Medea, no matter what, know that your mother and I loved you like a true daughter. We never meant to keep this from you, but we're just waiting for the right time. Time slips by so fast, it seems.
From behind him, he produced a jeweled headpiece that was something of a cross between a tiara and a crown. The crown was made of a beautifully wrought and intricate gold-colored metal. In it were 3 dark blue jewels in the shape of tears, 2 small ones on either side of the largest one in the middle. Amazingly, on the inside could be seen small filaments of circuitry, pulsing gently with aqua-colored light. And right at the bottom where it would rest on the forehead was an inscription, "To my beloved Sophie."
This was with you when we found you, and now you should have it back. Is this Sophie's crown? The ancient lost artifact?
She said, taking it from his hands with intense reverence and looking at it in awe.
Your mother thought so, and so do I. I don't know what it means, but I believe it is very important you have it.
He took it from her hands, and gently placed it on her head. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made just for her. She gasped, and grabbed Chesney's hand in surprise. To his astonishment, he could feel an amazing sensation flowing into him from Medea. All the aches and pains were fading away. In all of Lennis, in all the universe, there was no magic that could heal wounds. Not like this. Whatever that was, it was incredible, unique, unprecedented.
This is impossible,
she muttered.
Isn't it? Can I really have this?
Malspar chuckled.
Ah, I see. It does indeed only work for you, just as I guessed. I am more convinced than ever that destiny is afoot here. Of course you can. It's yours.
He moved to hold her in one last tight embrace.
Medea, come back any time. This is your home, now, and forever, and you will always be my precious daughter.
She sniffed, and said,
Will you watch over everyone for me, Daddy? Ha! Those babies need to learn to look after themselves after all this time,
he said, but at her honest, worried frown, he softened and said,
Of course, dear. You don't even need to ask.
When at last they parted, her father produced a letter, and held it out to Chesney.
One last thing. Master Dacant wrote this for me to give to you when you returned. He was very insistent that you read it the moment you got back, but I couldn't give it to you until now.
With a shaky hand, he reached for it. A dozen half-formed terrors sped through his mind. His whole being cringed at what more could be written in it. Part of him told him to run, or tear it up, throw it in the fire. But he could never. Whatever fresh new wound this might be, he would endure it. He braced himself, opened the letter, unfolded the paper, and began to read. Chesney, I pray with all my heart that you return from the mission that you have set yourself upon. For if you did not survive to read this letter, it would haunt me for the remainder of my days. First, I must say, I am so sorry. When we last spoke, I was insane with grief. When at last I regained my senses, and realized what I had done, I was racked by a whole new fresh grief, fearing I had sent you to your death. When I spoke to my old friend Malspar, he told me of the dangerous quest you had undertaken to rescue Medea. It was then I knew that you had truly taken my terrible words to heart, and I resolved to fix the damage I had done. Chesney, this was not your fault. There are so many other places to lay the blame for this tragedy, but it is not at your feet. Your life matters. Please, do not throw it away in your own grief. You did not create the ancient machine, Dahlgren. You did not leave it unguarded. You were never taught the truth of the tower. Do not blame yourself for what happened. Your life is precious, Chesney. I would love nothing more than to beg you to return to the safety of your home in Rayold, and to let the leaders of the world rally to save it. But I'm afraid I must ask you to do the impossible. Please, Chesney, continue your journey. I do not know all the details, but one thing I do know is that not just anyone could have activated Dahlgren. This is a secret passed down from headmaster to headmaster at this school, and why the tower was mostly unguarded, because we felt that it was impossible to be activated. Your mysterious access to the Tower of Gabnid, the rope network north to Raold being cut, Medea being kidnapped? There is much going on, and there must be a connection. You must seek the great spiritualist Daphne for advice. I feel very strongly that you will be absolutely essential in the monster's defeat, which is why I must ask you to be brave and continue bearing this terrible burden. Not as a punishment you owe to the world, not because I ask, not because of your conscience, because you may be our only hope. I will stay at the school, for now. There is much to be done, and when it is rebuilt, it would make this old man happy if you returned. I don't ask for forgiveness for what I have done, but you will always have a home at this school. Be safe, Chesney, now, and forever. Dykent. By the time Chesney had finished reading the letter, it was dotted with tears. It was at last too much. It was more than he could hold in any more, and now, he no longer wanted to. Headmaster Dykent was right. He would have kept throwing himself into every danger he could as payment for his failure, until he was broken and dead. His body racked with fresh sobs as he held the letter close to his chest, and collapsed to his knees. He knew he would never be free from the guilt of what he had done, but these words felt truly healing to his badly wounded heart. Silently, Medea knelt beside him, and held him until long after the sobs had stopped. She saw his wounded soul, and vowed again to herself to help him carry this weight.
You're not alone anymore, Chesney. I'll follow you wherever you go.